everybody. This is Dr. Lori Shemek.
And I'm Omar Cumberbatch. You're listening to This Podcast Burns Fat. Hey, Lori, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Hey, everybody. Happy New Year.
Oh, boy. I can't believe we're back at it again.
2023.
Wow.
I know, right? 2022 went fast. Just wait. We're just starting.
I know. Yeah, it's going to be a good year. I'm really excited about it. We have so many awesome guests coming up. And I thought this year to set it off, especially after the holidays, I don't even want to eat, let alone intermittently eat.
Yeah.
I think I'm just going to do a whole month of fasting.
You're just going to starve.
I'm so sick of food.
Oh, I love it. Yeah. So we thought, you guys, that we'd start the year off with somebody who would really clean up our body, clean up the junk and the muck and everything we did bad to it, with Cynthia Thurlow. And she's a nurse practitioner. She's an author of The Intermittent Fasting Transformation. She has her own incredible podcast called Everyday Wellness Podcast. She has an incredible TEDx speaker. You need to check that out. It's incredible. Her story is on there. And she's an intermittent fasting expert, largely, and is truly, if you follow her on social media, you will reap a large amount of information benefit. So, she was wonderful.
Yeah, no, definitely going to teach us how to do the intermittent fasting the right way. And that was another element to the show that was really exciting, was that, we've discussed in the past certain methods that are typical that people follow regarding intermittent fasting, but she really breaks it down in just how it affects people in certain ways that we wouldn't imagine, and really how to navigate some of the things that maybe can be problematic for people who are trying to dive into this unknowingly, and it really just drops a lot of knowledge.
Yeah, and how to do it right and what not to do, etc. So, yeah.
All right.
Really enjoyed it. Okay.
Yeah, let's jump into the show.
Okay.
Hey, Cynthia, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Cynthia. So great to have you. We're so happy you dropped by.
Absolutely.
And really excited to have you here because, as we were talking about, intermittent fasting is a huge topic, and it's because of so many wonderful things about it, right? And people have a lot of questions about it. But so for our listeners, Cynthia Thurlow is a nurse practitioner. She is an intermittent fasting and nutrition expert and a 2-time TEDx speaker. Wonderful, wonderful work she does. And, she focuses mainly on helping women find wellness. Her book, Intermittent Fasting Transformation, the 45-day program for women to lose stubborn weight, improve hormonal health, and slow aging, is doing fantastic. And so she's going to talk to us a little bit about that and intermittent fasting and all that good stuff. So Cynthia, would you just mind giving us a little bit about your background? And I know you've been through a horrific experience, for one.
Yeah, it's interesting. As a clinician, I was an ER nurse in inner city Baltimore, and it was a kind of natural transition to working in cardiology as an NP for 16 years. I'm a total adrenaline junkie. I like figuring out critically sick and acutely sick people. But I definitely got to a point occupationally where I was not challenged as I had been at the very beginning. And I think a great deal of it was the realization that a lot of allopathic medicine is focused on symptom management as opposed to root cause management. And I was far more interested in talking to patients about lifestyle and nutrition. And there just isn't enough time in your schedule. You're expected to see new patients every 15 to 30 minutes. In the hospital, you're expected to see patients at an exorbitant pace. And so for me, 6 years ago, I left clinical medicine and took an entrepreneurial leap of faith And I jokingly say I left without a business plan, which I don't recommend for anyone, but I
did that too.
Yeah. I told my husband, I couldn't write another prescription. I literally could not, be that team player anymore. And I love being a nurse practitioner. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to work with thousands and thousands of patients. And so I took this leap of faith and I told my husband, who's an engineer, is very fiscally conservative, I know I'm going to be successful. And he kind of gave me a little bit of latitude, said, okay, you've got this much time. And then if, this idea doesn't come to fruition, then we need to talk about it again. And so almost instantaneously, I started attracting women that were around my age that felt their needs were grossly underserved. And I could not have agreed more. And I really opened up a practice of helping women in perimenopause, the 10 to 15 years preceding menopause, and menopause find ways to thrive. And one of those strategies that I myself started using around that time was intermittent fasting. And I started integrating it into all the work I was doing. And then we fast forward until 2018, and I'm an introvert. And I told my husband, I think a scary goal would be to do a TED Talk. And of course, he thought I was bananas. And so I submitted a lot of applications and was offered my first, which I did in December of 2018. And around that time, I was offered my second. And if you're at all familiar with the way that TEDx organizers organize their events, you can't do the same talk twice. And so I had to pick a topic. And I said to my husband, what do I know a lot about? And he said, oh, intermittent fasting. And that was as much thought as I put into that topic. It was literally like, I know a lot about this, and then I'm going to do it. And the irony is, in 2019, the most Googled and searched nutritional concept strategy was intermittent fasting.
But still is.
Yeah. It's kind of remarkable. And the irony is, right before I was going to be giving my talk, I had accompanied my husband on one of his business trips, came home, thought I had food poisoning. Turned out I didn't have food poisoning. What I had was a ruptured appendix, and that started a 13-day hospitalization. And when I say that as a clinician, recognizing how sick you are was definitely a very humbling experience. And so it was 13 days in the hospital. And then throughout that hospitalization, having conversations with myself, with my family, and saying, when I get out, it wasn't a question of if, although there were times when I saw so many different specialists, they kept saying, we don't know why you're so sick. Understand that if I got out of that hospital bed, I wanted to get home to my family, and I also wanted to do this talk. And so I
was just going to say, when you have a ruptured appendix, it is life or death, really.
It can be. It definitely can be. And I think the irony is, I used to call the appendix a vestigial organ, which means an organ that has no purpose. And that's the irony of working as an ER nurse. I saw a lot of ruptured appendixes or impending ruptured appendixes. And so I went home and, I told the TEDx organizers I still wanted to do this talk. And they were a little skeptical, although supportive. And I actually, 27 days after I left the hospital, I went on to do a talk to prove to my children I was okay, that changed our lives on every level. And I had no idea that talk would be so well received. And the biggest irony of all is that I did that talk with a ruptured appendix, and 10 days later, I had my appendix out because I was too sick to remove it prior to that point.
I didn't know that. Oh my goodness. Wow. You did incredible.
Yeah. What's funny is I can't watch that talk. People ask me, do you ever watch it? And I was like, no. I think, your brain sometimes doesn't catch up with your body. And so for me at that time, my brain still felt like I'm the normal person that I am. But when I watch it, it's the realization I'm like, I look very kind of gaunt and skinny. And I think there was so much nervous energy that I was moving around a lot. And so, from my perspective, I'm delighted that the content resonated with so many people. And when I say we, my team and I get messages every day from individuals that watched the talk and took action and changed their lives. And, what a greater, I can't think of a greater compliment,
I know it. And helping people in that way, it's just profound. Yeah,
absolutely. So I feel very grateful. So that's a little bit about me. And then, from that point on, that kind of, my business really, really changed enormously. And my husband no longer thinks it's a hobby, which is a good thing. But it's really given me an opportunity to talk on a bigger platform and to be able to reach more people and impact more lives. And that's really what it's about. All the work that we do is really about helping people, get information, get connected to good resources, inspire people to take action, or inspire people to learn more about what's going on with their bodies. And that's the greatest compliment I could ever receive.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great story.
Yeah.
So, Cynthia, like obviously you stumbled upon intermittent fasting. How did you stumble upon it, and how did you personally implement it in your life, especially when in the beginning?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm a researcher. That's my personality. It's like someone may bring up a concept, but I have to do my own research. And during the course of 1 week in very early 2016, a colleague had mentioned intermittent fasting, and then someone else had mentioned intermittent fasting. And I actually read Jason Fung's book, and when I've interacted with Jason, each and every time I always give him credit. I said, "Your book gave me the courage to feel like embracing the research and making this an achievable strategy for most people is reasonable." So that was where it started. And for me, I came to intermittent fasting initially as a perimenopausal woman who had never experienced having weight loss resistance. And all of a sudden, with all those hormonal fluctuations and stress and over exercising and, the hectic pace of being an NP in cardiology and little people at home, for me, I came to it to change body composition. And that didn't happen instantaneously. It happened later, but I felt so much more cognitively clear. I felt so much more energy. And I said to my husband, I'm definitely onto something. Everything I've been telling my patients for the last 20 years is bunk. Telling my patients to eat to stoke your metabolism, have snacks and mini meals is complete garbage. Mm-hmm. And so it really was a massive paradigm shift for me personally. But it started with a 16-8. I mean, I'm pretty metabolically flexible. And so I went from probably 14 hours fasted pretty readily into 16 to 18 hours fasted. And I felt good. And, at that time, I didn't know to fast for your menstrual cycle. So I would recognize that there were times in my cycle where I would struggle more with, why can't I get beyond 12 or 13 hours? Mm-hmm. Now I know why that happens. But for me, it really started initially with just a pretty basic 16-8 and not doing a lot of dietary changes, although additional tweaking came later. But it really started that innocently. And actually, my husband, to his credit, joined me because he's all about, we're a team, we do this together. And it really evolved into something that was quite extraordinary.
Yeah, that's really something, it's especially when your husband decides to join you.
Yes. And it's funny. He now convinces his friends at work and all of his buddies, he's got a whole generation of his peers that are now fasting. And I just say all the time, I think, one of the things that, I would say for the rest of my life, I will be apologizing for a lot of misinformation, intentioned misinformation that was doled out to patients. But I do think
we all did it because we all believed, due to the quote unquote research out there, that we were recommending the right thing.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So I tell everyone should not eat for 12 hours a day.
Right. And people, absolutely.
They think about that. And even I have growing teenagers, and we talk about that, I mean, they're very anabolic right now. They're one's 6 foot tall, one's 5'7", they're probably both still growing. And we talk about that really openly, that it's important to have periods of time that we don't eat during the day. And they totally get that. And people will ask me all the time, do your teenagers fast? And I was like, no, because they're growing, but we've also ingrained in them, in a degree of intuitive eating. And I think that that's kind of a lost art, largely because our population is, largely metabolically unhealthy. So fasting and really getting to a point where your body is in a position where it is more hormonally balanced. And that's not just a catch-all phrase. I just say that because there's so many hormones that impact satiety and hunger cues and insulin. And so really explaining that there's so many factors that impact that. But having a period of time where we don't eat at all is really, really important.
Yeah. And with that, could you, for the listeners that don't really know what intermittent fasting is, just briefly let them know?
Yeah. So intermittent fasting is as easy as saying eat less often. And I think that it gets a misnomer. There's definitely still a lot of fear mongering that goes on. Intermittent fasting is not starvation. You are choosing to not eat within a specific time period, and you're choosing to eat within a specific time period. The best example I can provide is when you get to a point where your body is acclimated to intermittent fasting, you may have an 8-hour feeding window, meaning depending on the individual, you could have 2 to 3 meals in that feeding window, and then you choose not to eat the other 16 hours out of the day, most of which you are sleeping. So it's not nearly as arduous as it sounds to be. There's lots of variations of intermittent fasting. The 16-8, I think, is achievable for most individuals. There are, variations like OMAD, which is 1 meal a day. And there's variations that are, 24, 48, 72-hour fasts. Those are definitely more, I refer to those
advanced,
advanced strategies. But intermittent fasting is as simple as eating less often and understanding that one of the key ways to think about fasting is it's designed to be flexible. Some people fast differently every day. Some people only fast Monday through Friday. Some people really lean into the cues that their body's sharing with them, depending on what life stage they're in. So women at peak fertile years, 35 and under, need to fast differently than women in perimenopause and menopause and men. So there's a lot of variability, but much like we don't eat the same foods every day, we shouldn't. We don't do the same exercise every day. We should really, once we are fat adapted, once our body is acclimated to using different types of fuel substrates to fuel our body, we should adjust our fasting kind of methodology and hours in which we fast.
So why does intermittent fasting work?
It's a great question. Fasting works on a lot of different levels. First and foremost, when we are not eating as frequently and we optimize insulin. Insulin, unfortunately, has been made out to be the boogeyman, that it's this bad hormone. And it's a wonderful hormone, but in a lot of people, it's not properly regulated. So when we're in an unfed state, over time, our body can lower our insulin levels because we're not eating food. Insulin is secreted in response to when we eat and drink foods that have nutrients or macronutrients in them. And so when we're in this unfed state, our body can go in and free up a different type of fuel, fatty acids, to fuel the body. And much like a car, we have different types of fuel that our body utilizes. So we want to be able to be flexible and use both glucose and insulin. But when we're talking about the ways in which, intermittent fasting is particularly effective, one of them is lowered insulin levels. So lowered insulin levels lead to less inflammation, less oxidative stress. When we're in this unfed state, our body can go in and scavenge up diseased and disordered cells. This is a process called autophagy. It doesn't get turned on and off per se. It gets upregulated or downregulated depending on what we're doing. So I would say blood sugar balancing is the number one, focus. A reduction in inflammation because you're not chronically eating all day long. It allows your digestion to be optimized. There's a process called the migrating motor complex, and it almost acts as a street sweeper or a janitor, if you will, of the digestive system. And it can't be optimized when we're eating constantly. So, one of the other really interesting, quirky ways that intermittent fasting helps optimize digestion, so you're able to absorb your nutrients, you're likely very much less bloated, less inflammatory processes. So even if you do nothing else other than eating less frequently, I'll hear patients tell me they're less bloated, their digestive processes and bowel movements are more regular. They feel a lot lighter. And I think a lot of the benefits of intermittent fasting vis-a-vis, time restricted eating and looking at weight loss reduction, I focus and lean into the carb insulin model. So keeping insulin levels low, adjusting carbohydrates, and also understanding that when you're eating in a compressed feeding window, you're eating less food. And it's not, solely focused on calories. I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of the bro science individuals out there that I respectfully say that it's more than just calories in, calories out.
Exactly.
We're not a bomb calorimeter. We're not measuring, there's so much more to our bodies. We're so much more sophisticated than just counting calories and counting macros. And so, this happens quite a bit on Twitter, as a matter of fact. And I have to kind of say respectfully, I don't actually believe in that model. I really believe in this carbohydrate insulin model, and hormones are what drive weight loss or weight loss resistance. And so balancing blood sugar and insulin is absolutely critical. Cortisol is another hormone that can be, optimized with fasting. But I think it's also important because cortisol can impact weight loss resistance or weight loss. And so I think it's important for people to understand, like, cortisol, yes, that is a stress hormone, but it can also be upregulated if we are eating highly inflammatory, highly processed, hyperpalatable foods, if we're not sleeping. And to really think of intermittent fasting as a type of stress for the body, understanding that hormesis or hormetic stressors are designed to make us stronger or more resilient. But if, as an example, you are going through a divorce, you lost your job, you're not sleeping, you just have a lot of stress, like adding in intermittent fasting is like adding gasoline to a fire. Yeah. So we want to make sure that our body feels safe. It feels that it's not under duress as we're adding these things. And that's why I generally recommend that people start fasting from the perspective of going low and slow, and not just, doing a full court press and saying, okay, I'm going from eating the standard American diet, being a couch potato, snacks and mini meals all day long, to tomorrow, I'm going to fast for 24 hours and I'm going to, I'm already stressed. I'm just going to add one more stressor. Adding more gasoline to the fire can be problematic. But a lot of the benefits from weight loss related to intermittent fasting are eating in that compressed window and really keeping insulin levels low, which has a cascade of other hormonal benefits in the body.
Yeah. And just to, if somebody is stressed, and depending on if they're eating a crappy diet, they're adding more inflammation to the body, more
Correct.
stress. And so, they're going through a divorce, they're not eating well. Now's not the time to do intermittent fasting.
No. And I think that's a common mistake that I see both men and women make. We have this very toxic diet culture. And so really helping people understand that intermittent fasting may indeed be a strategy that can be very helpful, but it's the right amount of stress at the right time in order for it to be effective. I find that there are a lot of women that hit perimenopause and menopause, and they're like, it has to be this, and I'm still going to do CrossFit 5 days a week and Orange Theory Fitness. I'm going to eat super low carb. And they wonder why their bodies are like, hey, this is too much stress. I'm not letting go of anything right now.
And speaking of crappy food, what about what is the problem you have with industrial seed oils in our food supply?
Well, they are proliferative.
I know what you think, but
yeah. No, they're definitely proliferative, which is hugely problematic when you understand that they are typically rancid, highly inflammatory. Dr. Kate Shanahan does such a beautiful job with collecting all the research. And, she's helped me understand over the last several years that when we're consuming these highly processed toxic oils, it drives insulin resistance and inflammation. It can steer us towards carbohydrate cravings, and you don't crave broccoli, you're going to crave junk, and can contribute to a lot of metabolic health issues that we're seeing. And because they're so proliferative, we as consumers have to read food labels. We have to ask when we're in restaurants, and you can probably assume if you're in the United States that you are exposed to these things unknowingly, and salad dressings. And you could be having $100 steak in a really upscale restaurant, and guess what they're putting down before they fire your steak? And so I think that just the growing awareness that they're in everything. I'll give you an example, Lori, that my one dog has had a little bit of digestive upset, and the vet and I were on the phone, and the vet said, oh, I've got this great probiotic. And because my dog is having such significant symptoms, I was like, fine. I went and bought it, and there's no ingredients on the product. And so I went down the rabbit hole after I gave it to him, because I was like, at this point, whatever's in it needs to work because he's having such significant symptoms. And what was the first ingredient? Soybean oil, which is ironically the number one consumed fat in the United States right now. And that is hugely problematic. And if you look at the research on like seed oils by themselves are bad. They're even more toxic if they're heated. They're even worse if they're heated multiple times. So think about when you go to a fast food restaurant and this highly oxidized, highly rancid, highly inflammatory oils that we're being exposed to all the time. And it's interesting because We don't eat out a lot, which probably isn't a surprise. But when we do, we try to enjoy it and try to make the best decisions. But because I wear a continuous glucose monitor, it's always interesting to me, and I encourage my patients to do the same. If you go to a restaurant and you eat a protein and vegetable focused diet, and all of a sudden your blood sugar is out of control, or your blood sugar goes spikes, and you don't understand why, you may very well have been exposed. Like when I get exposed to seed oils, it definitely impacts my blood sugar. And so it's that awareness that I think can be incredibly impactful. And in fact, I typically say to people, I'm less concerned. I mean, I am concerned, but like if you're starting with intermittent fasting as a strategy and you're not ready to make a lot of dietary changes, I would say if you do nothing else for yourself, avoid seed oils. And that eliminates most processed foods because it's such a cheap ingredient that the food industry loves using because they have such a high profit margin.
So cheap. Yeah. And we've got a couple examples would be canola oil is one, corn oil, vegetable oil, soy oil. Those are examples. And so we used to say, well, you need to read the labels for sugar. Now it's these oils, right?
Yeah.
So be very, very conscious of doing that, because if you want inflammation, that's what you're going to get. But what do you say, Cynthia, to the people that have a real problem? I get a lot of pushback on Twitter about when I post about these seed oils, that they're fine. The research shows they're fine.
Yeah.
But the research doesn't show that as well,
And Cynthia, sorry, just to piggyback on that question, and can you also explain like the difference between it when it's cooked and when it's just like in something like my favorite is mayonnaise. I do the avocado oil mayonnaise now, but they still exist in most of the conventional mayonnaises and dressings and such.
No, they definitely do. And I think that, if you're looking at animal-based models, there was actually a paper I presented, not my own paper, but someone else's paper I presented at a medical conference. And I was saying these was looking at rabbit models. And, here's the rabbit exposed to seed oils on their own, unheated, unadulterated. Well, they're adulterated, but we'll say unheated seed oil. And then looking at what happens to rabbits when they are exposed to heated seed oils once. And then looking at the rabbits exposed to seed oils over multiple times, over multiple iterations of reheated oils. And you're looking at steady increases of obesity and insulin resistance in rabbits. And, from my perspective, I always say, yes, this is not looking at a human model, but this is a mammal. And, from my perspective, if it's doing it to the rabbit and you look at the late 1960s, I forget the exact date, that, this is when the rise of the processed food industry with not only high fructose corn syrup, but also the rise of seed oils. And you start looking at obesity rates that's really accelerated over the last 25 years. I mean, certainly since I started in medicine in the late 1990s. And from my perspective, when you understand that not only do seed oils destroy things at a cellular level, they're disrupting that phospholipid bilayer at the cellular level. They're driving oxidative stress. They're damaging our mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of our cells. They're driving inflammation. They are impacting our food choices. So, a lot of people make correlation isn't causation. But if we can, start connecting the dots between having these highly inflammatory seed oils and then dietary decisions that we're making next. So are you having these, adulterated fries that are fried in, soybean oil or canola oil? You're eating those, and then you eat a big brownie sundae that's like the size of, it's like 6 portions for one person. And then you feel like your appetite regulation is off because your blood sugar's off. Just understanding that all of these things ultimately lead to metabolic disease. They lead to over intake of carbohydrates. They lead to insulin resistance. And when only 7 to 8% of the population right now is identifiable as metabolically flexible, this is something that everyone needs to be concerned about. And I sometimes will hear, ironically, about the mayo. I don't like the taste of avocado oil mayo. And I remind people there's lots of recipes to make your own mayo at home without seed oils.
Yeah, and it's easy. Yeah.
It's pretty straightforward, but you have to decide like what's your poison. And for me, it's seed oils. Like my kids know we don't have a chip in our house with a seed oil in it. And I have teenagers, And I tell everyone, like, I'm a realist. I think when they were younger, I could be much more, constrained, like, oh, we don't have this in our house and we don't have that. And now I have to identify, the one chip in the grocery store that doesn't have seed oils in it that they'll eat. Because sometimes that's what they want to have, a chip. But I think for each one of us, we have to understand that, those choices have profound net impact. When our cellular membranes get disrupted from adulterated seed oils, it lasts a long time, up to 2 years. So it is not benign. So the choices we make yesterday have a long-term impact on the health of our cellular membranes. And so people are saying, well, I don't care about my cells. Well, you should, even if it seems very kind of obtuse.
That's a foundation.
Yeah, exactly. A foundation for our health. So, seed oils are probably the one ingredient I really encourage people. If you do nothing else, even if you don't do gluten-free or dairy-free or whatever paradigm you kind of align with, just avoiding seed oils will ensure that you're likely eating a lot less inflammatory, highly processed, hyperpalatable foods.
And also, you mentioned Dr. Kate Shanahan. She's been on our show, and she is an excellent resource. So, you might, our listeners might want to go back to that show a couple months ago. We had her on, and but her website is fantastic. She has the good, the bad, and the ugly. In terms of the seed oils.
Yeah. And I've had colleagues, like physicians and nurses, that have, tried to battle that out with me. And I always say, listen, if you don't believe me and you don't believe what I'm saying, I just point them to her website, and then they don't come back to me anymore.
I love that. Oh my gosh.
It's amazing.
It really is. So one of the things that obviously just as probably popular as intermittent fasting nowadays is just the gut health and the microbiome. So how does intermittent fasting actually help the gut and the microbiome?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think on a lot of levels, when we're eating less frequently, I talked about the migrating motor complex a lot, which is the janitor, kind of pushes debris forward in the gut. I also think about it allows your body to actually assimilate nutrients. We get a reduction in inflammation because our body's not chronically trying to process all of this food. If you fast long enough, this doesn't happen when you're fasting for 16 hours, but you fast long enough. And if you look at the research, anywhere from 3 to 5 days, you're going to impact stem cells. You are going to impact telomere length. And I know for a lot of the anti-aging experts, this is a lot of why they do these really long fasts, but really being clear about what your goals are, I think is really important. But when it comes to gut health, I think about, we have these circadian clocks in the gut. And what people don't realize is, yes, melatonin is a sleep hormone. It's also a master antioxidant. And what happens, as an example, yes, we do have melatonin that's secreted in a gland in our brain called the pineal gland. We also have circadian clocks in our gut. So this is why when you eat 2 hours before bed and you have reflux and you feel terrible, maybe you have night sweats if you're a female, that has a lot to do with the fact that your body's confused. Your body is thinking it's going to be telling these melatonin clocks to secrete melatonin, but instead what they're doing is pumping up cortisol because they're trying to process this food bolus or food boluses that you've been consuming. And it's very confusing to the clock. But the clocks, let me make that plural. There are actually more of these clocks in the gut, and why it's so important to me, making sure we're providing, our bodies with the appropriate cues in terms of digestion. So for me, those are some of the big high points. But also understanding that, our when we think about from our mouth to our anus, I think a lot of people don't think about all the organs that are involved in between those two, entry point and exit point in the body. But there's so much that can be optimized when we're not eating all day long and overtaxing this digestive system, which is really designed to function really nicely and optimally. But when we're feeding ourselves all day long and drinking a lot of our calories from sugar sweetened beverages, and don't even get me started on all the artificial sweeteners. That's a whole separate thing that can really negatively impact the gut microbiome. But there's certainly quite a bit of research that talks about optimization of good versus bad bacteria in the gut when you're giving your digestion an opportunity to fast, or not to have to be working at digesting food as opposed to just absorbing nutrients, moving things forward, allowing things to be fully optimized.
That's really well said, Cynthia. Yeah. So there is a problem, though, in my opinion, with getting enough protein in with fasting. A lot of people, I just eat one meal a day and, I'm good and I feel great. And I worry about they do this chronically and every day. And I worry about their muscle mass and particularly as they get older.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because I have two podcasts. I inherited one. So I co-host the Intermittent Fasting podcast, and the other co-host, who's a wonderful person and someone that I'm friends with, is a fan of OMAD. But I always say that, when I inherited this podcast, that I was going to end up, probably making some people angry, because I said, there's no way you can maintain muscle protein synthesis. You can't maintain muscle mass eating 30 to 40 gram bolus of protein a day.
Exactly.
And so I always come from the perspective of understanding that muscle is an organ of longevity, that it is a huge glucose reservoir. And I remind people, like, when we're 20 and 30, our muscles are more like filet if you're a healthy person. And then as we get older, there's a process called sarcopenia. So we will have muscle loss with aging. We'll have muscle strength loss with aging. It's not a question of if, but when, but you have to do all the things to make sure you are maintaining lean muscle. And part of that is eating enough protein. And so I find most women, not as much men, but most women are eating maybe 40 to 50 grams a day, even if they've got it divided into 2 meals. So that's why OMAD is fine if someone overeats the day before, they go on vacation, maybe they ate too much food, they want to get back on track, but it is not a sustainable strategy. Certainly, there's no way. I don't know any woman that can get 100 grams of protein in one meal. Maybe some guys can, but
the body cannot metabolize that much,
right.
Or at least it's not usable.
Yeah. And so it's one of those things where I always say, like, 2 boluses of protein in a feeding window is really the way to go. And so I find there are many women that have broken metabolisms because they have for years just under-eaten for such a long period of time. And they wonder why they're weight loss resistant, even though they're doing, quote unquote, all the right things. And I remind them that, this concept of reverse dieting, of which I am not an expert, but really helping people understand that you need to slowly start increasing your protein intake. And it may take a period of time, but it's really critically important for metabolic health to maintain that muscle mass. And unfortunately, we as healthcare providers do a really crummy job of explaining that to men and women, to say, you're going to hit your peak bone and muscle mass in your 20s and 30s. No, by the way, by the time you hit 40, you start losing.
It goes south.
You start losing the muscle. And then what's interesting, I just had a bone health expert on, and one of the things he was talking about in terms of his tocotrienol research was that, so when we are in puberty, our body is massively focused on bone building, which is a good thing. And then in menopause and andropause, our body is doing exactly the opposite. So we get more osteoclastic activity, which is breaking down bone. And it's just important for people to know, because I took care of so many patients who were like 60, sometimes 60 years young. 60 sounds awfully young to me.
Yeah, me
especially
too.
the older I get, I'm like, that sounds really young. But I would have these relatively young patients that would fall and like break their hip. And I'm like, I used to think about it, the 90-year-old grandmothers. No, lots of younger people are breaking hips because they were never instructed on what we need to be doing heading into middle age to really maintain both muscle and bone health.
Was that tocotrienol, I can't ever pronounce that name, expert? Was that Dr. Barry?
Yes, Dr. Tan. I actually, and it's interesting because when he, so I'm sure much like you all, my team says, oh, this person would like to be a guest, and you have to say yay or nay. And I didn't know a lot about his research when I said yes. And then when I started diving into it, I kept saying, oh my gosh, this is so wonderful to learn about, because how many women are osteopenic, which you can't compare, like as an example, you can't compare the bone strength and density of a 50-year-old to a 20-year-old, but that's what happens when you go for these DEXA scans, which is kind of unfair. But how many women don't want to go on biphosphates because of all the potential side effects? To know that there are options, in the tocotrienols, and yes, it is a tongue twister, that there are options in terms
you did
of
that well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, because I said it so many times before I interviewed him, I was like, I'm just going to keep saying it. These derivations of vitamin E derived from this annatto plant that have such incredible research on it, that why not try that?
He was a wealth of information on our show.
He's amazing. He's
it
so
really,
passionate.
truly, I know. Yeah.
Yeah, what was cool about him too, Lori, remember like how vitamin E in the 80s like went as something popular and it was tanked, and then how he found it into that through that plant.
Yep.
It just completely converted over. Yeah, it was just real fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because even some of my listeners were saying how, when they saw the title of the podcast, they weren't sure they wanted to listen. And then they said his enthusiasm is so infectious and that it was so easy to listen to him. And I say all the time, well, of course, because I want to make sure I bring interesting guests to the masses.
Right.
But how nice it is to know that there are vitamins created in nature that can be so beneficial for not just metabolic health, bone health, and certainly in the context of other areas of work, even in some cancer trials. Yeah.
No, absolutely. So I guess one of the questions that always comes up, and I think there's differing opinions, what exactly breaks the fast? Because a lot of people, including myself, love black coffee to actually help us prolong fasting. Is your opinion on that like different? Is it something that is just really about not taking in calories, or is it any kind of metabolic reaction that your body has that affects fasting?
I love this question. I'm a proponent of a clean fast. So in a clean fast, things like water, unflavored electrolytes, bitter coffee, bitter tea. There's a lot of plant-based compounds, some of the polyphenols that can upregulate fat oxidation. I am not a coffee drinker, neither is my husband, but I have learned to enjoy green tea because there's just too many benefits not to enjoy it. Yeah. And so when I think about what constitutes a clean fast, things like cinnamon can help if someone is struggling with the taste of bitter coffee. And let's be honest, I think most people probably grow up having a lot of cream and sugar in their coffee. So they're really not drinking coffee. They're really having a lot of cream and a lot of sugar with a splash of coffee. And so helping people understand that cinnamon will help boost insulin sensitivity. It's not going to break a clean fast. Salt, like sometimes adding high quality salt like Redmond's to coffee can help change the flavor profile. So there's lots of different ways. I'm not a fan of people ingesting food during a fasting window. And there are a lot of people out there, and I want to believe they're well-meaning, but they'll, add copious amounts of butter and MCT oil.
That's breaking the fast.
Yeah. And I remind them, I'm like, butter's actually insulinemic. So it's not, if you're understanding,
it's like keto, but not.
Right. So I tell people a couple things. So if you're coming from a standard American diet to fasting, and the differentiator for you to be able to help become fat adapted is that you use some MCT oil, I'm okay with that, with the understanding that all those fats that you add to your drink are not calorically neutral. They still count. Sometimes I think people don't understand that 300 or 400 calorie coffee is not like benign. It's not like it checks the box.
That's a really great point.
And so I say, if you're fat loss resistant or weight loss resistant, just be mindful of what you're consuming. So, from my perspective, food is different. There are a lot of, I'll just say fit pros out there that say things like, you can have 50 calories or less. And I just say, listen, if you need to break your fast earlier, just break your fast. Don't, white knuckle fasting. That's not the way to do it. Definitely lean into the fact that, some days you need to break your fast earlier. And if you're, starving, break your fast, but don't eat a bowl of grapes and think that doesn't count. This is where I get frustrated. The processed food industry is trying so darn hard to convince people that they can eat food during a fast to make it easier. And so there was a company.
And the keto products as well.
Yes. Yes. Because they do fudgy math and they're like, oh, well, we reduce the net carbs and there's no sugar in it, but it's a artificial sugar, but it doesn't count because it doesn't impact your blood sugar. And I'm like, wait a minute. There was that non-nutritive, and I'm sure you probably read that study looking at non-nutritive sweeteners. And it was looking at like NutraSeat and sucralose and stevia and saccharin. And I don't know who's still using saccharin. That's like 1970s tab.
I know.
Like my grandmother used to drink.
I remember that when I was a little girl.
Yeah. My grandmother loved tab. Like my grandmother who was a nurse. I always thought it was so curious. But really looking at the fact that no, maybe your blood sugar on a glucometer doesn't change, but we know it changes the gut microbiome constituency. We know it impacts oral glucose tolerance testing. So it's not benign. So for all these people that are constantly looking for the next great thing, oh, it doesn't make my blood sugar, change. It's interesting. I always think about Vinnie Tortorich's No Sugar, No Grains. And I spoke at an event with him this summer. And honest to God, and the question always comes up. It always comes up for him, which I always find interesting. And someone said, "What's your favorite sweetener?" And he was like, "None." And they were like, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Because you're just looking for a replacement. You still have to address the fact that you've got a sugar addiction." And it was
That's such a great anscer.
Yeah. And Vinny's such a straight, like he's so,
I love he's hilarious.
He's very funny. And he doesn't, he's one of these people that is such a straight shooter and it comes from such a good place. But when he said that, the whole room got quiet. And then I think people had this collective exhale, like, thank you for saying that. Because I think people are constantly looking for the next sweetener that doesn't, quote unquote, have a blood sugar response. I have people, I'm sure this happens to you too, who want to argue with me and my team about stevia, and they want to argue about monk fruit. And I just told my team, I was like, we're not arguing. We're not going to argue about it. It's silly.
I just don't answer.
No,
it's kind of like, whatever you choose, just make sure it's a healthy.
Correct.
And if you want something sweet, baking, like during the holidays, etc., those types of sweeteners are fine, for most people.
And I think it's, I feel like after going to a lot of low carb and keto events this year, there's so much junk. Like there is paleo junk food and keto junk food and low carb junk food. And a lot of things, admittedly, probably much like for you both, come to my house. And I have to sometimes just throw things away. Like there's so much sucralose in a lot of these quote unquote keto, low carb foods,
whey proteins.
Yeah. And I'm like, no way. And it's interesting. So my 15-year-old is my foodie, and we're constantly, it's like a battle of wits to try to find like a replacement for something. And so we had a battle of wits about protein powder because he's a swimmer and I understand he needs a lot of protein. And sometimes he's like, Mom, I can only eat so many, Paleo Valley meat sticks or like a meat bar when I'm in between a meal and I'm hungry. And I'm like, I get it. And so trying to find him clean whey protein powder. And we finally found a compromise. But I was trying to explain to him, I was like, don't show me anything that has sucralose in it. It's going to be a no. And so we had to have this conversation.
For sure.
We had to have this whole conversation about why there's so much junk in, the 7-Eleven and the Wawa. And, he goes to grab an energy drink and, trying to navigate, explaining to him, like, I really am not comfortable buying you something that's sweetened with sucralose. And he's like, I don't care about my gut bacteria. I just need some energy.
You're not when you're that age.
Coffee?
Yeah, go for the coffee.
So you mentioned early on that some people should not be fasting for whatever reason, right? But what groups between men and women, who would you say has an easier time with fasting?
Oh, without question, men and menopausal women. The fact that menopausal women have gone 12 months without a menstrual cycle means that their hormones are largely, this is a big like blanket statement, largely much more stable day to day, week to week versus a younger woman that's still at peak fertile years under 35 or even perimenopause, where there's a lot of research to show that a woman's estrogen levels in perimenopause can be twice normal of what they are in someone who's in their peak fertile years. So without question, men and menopausal women. And the irony is much of the research that's been done on humans has been done on those age groups. So they don't have to take into the confounding variable of a menstrual cycle, but they have the easiest time. I have so many women, and I'm sure you probably have seen this as well, women who are, 60, 65, they're 10 plus years into menopause. They have not been able to lose, they call it their menopot, but their menopause belly. And, they start fasting and doing nothing else and they can lose 10, 20 pounds. And so, to me, I think that's a biological advantage at that age and stage. But without question, menopausal women and men have a much easier time. And I would say that the other caveat about men is, younger men that are still doing a lot of very physically demanding work, doing a lot of sports, like intense sports, they too have to be mindful of the intensity of what they're doing. Like I would, even if my kids wanted to fast, I wouldn't want them to.
Right.
But my husband, on the days that he does jujitsu, which is intense exercise, I sometimes will encourage him to have some carbohydrates or a little bit of protein before he goes, because he's so drained by the time he's done. And I think it's largely a byproduct of, doing that kind of that intense physical activity. And
so important.
It can be problematic, but it's a great question, and one that's really important, because I think a lot of people don't even consider where they are life stage wise and as it impacts hormesis and hormetic stress.
So Cynthia, to wrap and to also tie in what you had mentioned earlier about just society, probably for the last 30 odd years, just beating us in the head to eat a bazillion times a day. And now we have to consider intermittent fasting as a viable option, which we all share and understand is an awesome tool in the health toolkit. Like, how do we mentally prepare someone who's thinks this is crazy, like to
Well, I always say that sometimes the teacher comes when we're ready to do the work, but when we're in a position, if we're working with someone that is curious and is interested, I typically start like really with ripping off the Band-Aid of like the best way to get prepared is to stop snacking. And then people are like, what? And I'm like, no, you don't eat in between meals and you don't eat after dinner. And for a lot of people, that may take them several weeks to a month to be able to be capable of doing that. But I remind them that, first you have to kind of assign a goal. So it could be, I want to have more brain clarity. I want better insulin sensitivity, or I just want to lose weight. I mean, that's pretty common. You got to stop the snacking and explaining why snacking is derailing all your metabolic health goals. And then really restructuring your macros. So, that person that's eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner and isn't snacking anymore, in order to be able to make it from breakfast to lunch and lunch to dinner and dinner to breakfast, they have to push the protein. So how many people are eating 20 grams of protein in 3 meals and they wonder why they struggle to be able to go more than 2 hours without eating?
That's
really
an important point.
Yeah. You have to push the protein macros. Like I can easily eat 50 to 60 grams of protein in a meal, but it's taken me a long time to get there. But I find that that's an important differentiator. No snacking, restructuring macros, and then really going from dinner to breakfast without eating. And I think once people realize they spend most of that time sleeping, then it doesn't seem quite so overwhelming. And I think as each person gets to 12, 13, 14 hours and they realize like they don't feel like they're going to die, they feel pretty good, they understand what they can consume in a fasted state, water, electrolytes, unflavored electrolytes, bitter coffee, bitter tea, then they just stay really hydrated. And I find for a lot of people, hunger is not so much hunger for food, it could just be dehydration. And so many people are chronically dehydrated. And actually, one thing I learned about myself during the book launch was I was doing so much press, so many interviews every day, and I didn't want to have to pee in between. I didn't want to have to go to the bathroom because I usually stay really well hydrated. I didn't want to have to urinate during an interview. So I walked around being dehydrated all day long. And I said to my husband, I was like, oh my gosh, I just have forgotten what that's like. You're hungry. Sometimes you've got a headache. You just don't feel like you have a lot of energy. And that doesn't have to be people's normal. So that's usually the graduated steps that we take. Stop snacking, restructure your macros, going from dinner to breakfast, and then really, really focusing in on protein. And I find for a lot of people, it's food freedom when they realize how satiating protein is compared to just eating a bunch of carbs and fats, which typically don't occur in nature. That's the other thing. Like I remind people that carbohydrates and fats, generally, with the exception of maybe like an avocado, but really understanding that they generally don't go together in nature. And so, when you sit down with a bowl of chips and dip and you're wondering why it's like you can't just eat one, It's because you're overriding like the normal mechanisms. You can usually eat like a good sized steak and then you're like, I'm done. I can't eat 5 steaks. Whereas you could potentially convince yourself you could eat 2 bags of chips.
Right.
It's almost as if your brain doesn't register that you're even consuming that amount of food, let alone calories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's great. You've been just amazing today, Cynthia. So we are truly blessed to have you here. And I would love for people to know where to find you, all your social media places and your book and your podcasts and all that good stuff.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, both. It's been such a pleasure to interact with you outside of Twitter.
Yes.
Probably easiest to find me on my website. So it's www.cynthiathurlow.com. I am active on Instagram as well as Twitter. Be forewarned, I can be a little snarky. I have a free Facebook group called Intermittent Fasting Lifestyle / my name. There are men and women in that group. Everyone is welcome. I do have a book called The Intermittent Fasting Transformation IF45. And I have 2 podcasts, Everyday Wellness, and then also the Intermittent Fasting podcast that I co-host with Melanie Avalon. And there's a lot of synergy between our communities. And I really love for people to check those things out.
Excellent.
Yes.
Again, thank you so much for sharing all this wonderful insight. And I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of This Podcast Burns Fat. We're so excited to have you as a listener, and we're hoping that you've really enjoyed the content as well. And if you did, please run over to iTunes and provide a rating and or review. It will go a long way in helping us continuously build our listenership up so that we can provide you with excellent content regarding fat loss, weight management, and just an overall healthy lifestyle. Thanks so much. Have a great night.